Good morning, everyone, and welcome to CRI's webinar on state regulatory exams and how to prepare for them. My name is Jimmy Woodall, and I will be your moderator today. Before I tell you a little bit more about myself and our instructors, I want to go through a couple of housekeeping items. First, there will be no CPE for today's webinar. We do not anticipate reaching the time required for CPE, so we're not going to hand those out today. Second, questions. We want everyone to be actively involved and ask questions if you have anything that you want to be addressed through our webinar. If you look at the bottom right-hand corner of your panel, you will see a questions pane. Please type in your questions there during the session, and we will address those as they come about. All right, so now let's tell you a little bit about our instructors, myself. First, my name is Jimmy Woodall. I have a family. I have a wife and two children, a boy and a girl. I enjoy those lazy sports of fishing and golf. I spend a lot of my time watching my son swim, going to his swim meets. He's a swimmer. And I'm a veteran of the U.S. Air Force. Next, Francois Hu. Francois is one of our instructors. He's married. His wife is also a CPA, and together they have a 5-year-old daughter. His hobbies include internet, computers, and movies. He's a self-prescribed tech geek. Francois used to run marathons. He has run marathons in Delaware, Arizona, California, Louisiana, and Mississippi. He also went to Italy for the Florence Marathon, but then he ended up doing all kinds of tourist activities and didn't run the marathon. He does love traveling leisurely as much as possible. He's got one cat named Apple, like the computer, and he has one hamster named Goldie, Pumpkin, that his daughter named. Okay? Our next instructor is Joe May. Joe has a wife and 3 daughters. Joe enjoys watching almost every sport, but he doesn't do much playing anymore these days, any of those sports. He has a pet, toy poodle. It's named Bentley, and Bentley's the only other male in his house. And Joe also married a CPA. And he's been married to a CPA for about 19 years, and she is the only other interesting CPA that he has ever come across in his life. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and hand this off to Francois.
Okay, thank you, Jimmy. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us this morning. This morning's presentation is structured in 3 parts. First, we'll discuss what you should expect as the general outcome of an examination. Second, we'll go in detail over the framework or the process the state examiners need to follow when conducting an examination. And although we're talking about a self-assessment today, and it's not actually an examination, the approach we're following closely mirrors the one taken by the state examiners. And finally, we'll discuss some of the hot buttons on which state insurance departments are currently focusing their attention. So let's begin with the basics. When was the last time your company was examined by the state insurance department? If it's been a few years, chances are it's coming up very soon. The current NAIC guidance mandates all states to conduct a financial condition examination, or what they call now a risk-focused examination, at least every 5 years. As you're probably aware, the state insurance department in-house analyst performs limited reviews of your operation every quarter in the interim years. So some of you may have never had an examination before, especially if you're a newly formed entity or if you've entered a new market. Given this, let's begin with an overview of the state regulatory exam process. The playbook for this exam is the Financial Condition Examiner's Handbook. Let's just call it the Handbook. The Handbook is actually an NAIC publication, and anyone can purchase it. If you don't already have a copy, I highly recommend you get your own handbook. It's available both electronically to download or to get a paper copy directly from the NAIC website. And I think the current edition is currently $325. The handbook is updated annually, usually toward the end of the first quarter of the year. So the handbook lays out the process for the examiner to conduct the risk-focused examination. The primary purpose of the examination, as stated in the handbook, is to review and evaluate an examiner's business process and controls to assess in assessing and monitoring its current condition and financial prospective solvency. To do this, the examiner is looking at risks that could cause an insurer's surplus to be materially misstated, both currently and prospectively. Of course, the company could also be subject to market conduct examination and other types of audit or reviews. So what should you be doing to prepare for this type of scrutiny? Before we answer that question, let's take a few seconds to answer a poll question. Jimmy?
Okay. All right, so we've got a poll here for you. Which of the following applies to your company? Please select all that apply. 1, you're surprised by findings in your past regulatory exam reports. 2, you might have risks that could be found on your next regulatory exam. 3, our company has an upcoming regulatory exam. And 4, you feel prepared for your next state insurance department exam. So take a minute if you would, and please send us responses on those. Okay, looks like we've got a little over half of our participants have responded so far. Okay, looks like about everyone's in, close to everyone. So our responses look like about 40% of our respondents that say that they were surprised by the findings in their past regulatory exam. Also about 40% say our company has an upcoming regulatory exam. Another 20% said that they feel prepared for their next state exam, and about 20% have said that they might have risks that could be found in the next one. Francois?
Okay, that's good. So maybe you've had surprise findings from a previous exam, or maybe you've conducted an internal risk assessment and you've uncovered areas of concern. Or maybe you've received a notice from the state insurance department that your company is in line for an examination. These are all examples or scenarios when you want to make sure your company is fully prepared for that next examination. And even if you think you are prepared for examination, let's keep in mind that it's always better to uncover any potential issues internally before the insurance department does. Let's talk about the impact on your business of surprise findings during an examination.
Okay, thanks, Francois. Surprise findings is one of the worst things that can happen during an examination for a number of reasons. And cost is obviously one of the big downsides to surprise findings. And cost includes more than just what you pay the examiners. So how do you keep from having surprise findings? Well, first you do your homework and really be prepared for the exam. And the best way to be prepared is to kick off your regulatory exam by conducting a readiness assessment before the exam starts. And the assessment helps you detect issues before the examiners even get to the company. And you'll be far better off uncovering and dealing with issues internally as opposed to having a state insurance department examiner find them. And even if you uncover an issue that requires self-reporting to an insurance department, it's better to be proactive and address it with the department or to have an examiner, or rather than have an examiner find it through an examination. That's a much more formalized and time-consuming process. So next slide, we want to talk about some of the typical cost of a surprise finding. As I mentioned looking at the previous slide, one of the big downsides is surprise cost, and there are a number of things to consider when calculating true cost of an examination. We're going to walk through what we believe are the big ones. And the slide you're looking at, you're really looking at what we think are the big 4 cost drivers to an exam, and that's internal time, examination, legal expenses potentially, penalties, and unwanted attention. We're going to cover each one of these in more detail in the next few slides. Okay, the first one here, internal time. I believe this is one of the most underrated cost elements. People often overlook the time required to spend addressing exam issues by both themselves and their staff. And this slide highlights some of the really time-consuming steps involved in addressing a surprise finding. So we'll walk through each one of these. The first one we have is assessing the finding. So if the examiner brings a surprise finding to a company, the first thing you have to do is assess the finding. And this can take your time, potentially staff time, potentially review time of you and your team. So the next step is you'll either agree or disagree. If you happen to disagree, well, even more time is going to be spent because you'll have to build your case for the position and present it to the examiner and potentially in a more formal response to the department. The next step is actually preparing a written response, and whether you agree or disagree with the finding, it's most likely that you'll have to prepare some type of written response. And that varies some from state to state, but of course, it takes time to write, and in our view, if you don't have to actually have a written response, at the very least, you'll be talking with the examiner and walking through it. You may possibly have to meet with the department. It depends on the nature of the finding. That can drive what level of meetings may be required, but at the very least, you'll have to spend some time with the examiner going through everything. And the last one's really the worst case scenario in time is meeting with legal counsel. That's both time and expense, so hopefully that won't happen, but with certain violations such as privacy, consumer protection type violations, it might be necessary to speak with legal counsel. And that can obviously be an expensive endeavor. So those are the 5 major steps in dealing with a surprise finding. It just costs you time, and time is money. So when you're calculating the cost of an examination, don't forget to cover and consider all your time. On the next slide here, one of the more obvious costs to an examination is the amount that you pay the examiners and any related legal costs. And that's a lot easier to calculate than internal time, but there are a few things we want to consider, key things, when you're calculating this expense. One, the more time it takes the examiner to complete the exam, the more you're likely going to pay. In most states, companies pay for the examination cost directly. So when there's a surprise finding, or if you don't have anything ready for the examiner when they ask, it just takes more time that the examiner has to spend on it, and then they'll bill more time to the examination. Obviously, that's a direct cost to the exam. More serious violations require more time from the examiner. So the more time the examiner spends on building a case, researching an issue, then the more he's going to bill, he or she's going to bill to the examination, the more cost you'll incur. And remember that I mentioned on the previous slide, some of the things that you really watch out for is consumer protection laws. It can really cost a lot of time, and then again, if it includes attorney time, well, they bill by the hour, so that's even more cost. Okay, on this next slide, we have penalties. Penalties can vary widely based on the nature of the violation. Some penalties are explicitly determined in state statutes or other authoritative guidance, really such as timely pay or things of that nature that can occur on a per occurrence basis, cost driven on a per occurrence basis. And then there's other penalties that are left up to the discretion of the department. But if you perform a readiness assessment and find an issue that might require a penalty that's at the discretion of the department, it's a lot better to be proactive and take it to the department before the exam even starts. And they're much more likely to be lenient on a company that self-reports, and you could even get out of the penalty entirely. And as I said earlier, beware of consumer protection violation. These tend to be really the most expensive violations to deal with. And last but not least is unwanted attention. Now, people often forget that examination reports are public documents and often is published on an insurance department website. So even the smallest finding can reflect negatively on a company, especially if you have a few or even several that are shown up in a report. You probably don't have to worry about your average consumer downloading it, but journalists and watchdog groups, that's another story. And while the examination report's the primary mechanism for communicating findings in the exam, departments can also issue management letters, which are often confidential documents that's just not disclosed to the public. And some things that don't need to go into a public forum will be squeezed in that exam letter. An example would be if an examiner finds security weaknesses in an IT system. Well, you certainly don't want that kind of detail disclosed in a public document because that would essentially be a roadmap for a hacker. So those kind of things are more typically communicated rather to the companies in a management letter. And Francois is going to go over some more details of unwanted attention on the next few slides, and we'll dig into that.
Here's a good example of unwanted attention. This past April, CBS's 60 Minutes picked up on a series of settlements in which 25 of the largest insurance companies in the country agreed to pay $7.5 billion in back death benefit. At the time the story aired, an additional 35 insurance companies had not yet settled and remained under investigation. When a policyholder dies, and the beneficiary is not aware he or she is covered by a life insurance policy. Many life insurance companies don't proactively seek out that beneficiary to pay the claim. According to 60 Minutes report, they uncovered a systematic industry-wide practice of not paying a significant number of beneficiaries. This is more than an unclaimed property problem. It's an emotional issue that raises the ire of consumers and regulators. These insurance companies' practice may have complied with their contracts, but it's definitely not in the spirit of consumer protection. In fact, Florida and a number of other state-led investigations into these unclaimed property practices resulted in new laws requiring life insurance companies to search the U.S. Social Security Death Master File to determine when policyholders pass away and to make an attempt at least to contact the beneficiary. So what's the takeaway from this example of unwanted scrutiny? Well, these life insurance companies believed they were following appropriate protocol, but an outside observer had a completely different take on their actions. If any of these companies had conducted an internal risk assessment, they might have at least flagged these practices as potential areas of vulnerability. So what's the best way to prepare for your next state examination? We believe is to perform a readiness assessment. The assessment will help you to proactively detect issues. And as we mentioned before, you will be far better off uncovering and dealing with any issues internally or even reporting those issues to the insurance department yourself rather than having the state examiner uncover them.
Okay, insurance companies that conduct a readiness assessment prior to the state exam experience a number of benefits, and we're going to walk through some of those. We have 4 highlighted here. And the first one's opportunity to course correct, and it's always better to spot and deal with an issue internally rather than wait for a regulator to flag them. So if you uncover those problems early enough, then you'll have time to take corrective actions before your next exam. And that can involve internal corrective action plans or maybe meeting with the department to discuss issues prior to the exam starting. The next one is mitigating or eliminating regulatory penalties. Sometimes an item you uncover requires self-reporting. But if that's the case, and as we discussed on an earlier slide, penalties are typically far less severe and may even be eliminated if you self-report. The next one is streamlining the examination process. When you know the areas and the procedures and things that the examiner is going to be focused on, then you can prepare a complete file and have the documents and evidence that they're looking for ready when they ask. So, this can streamline the exam process, potentially saving your organization certainly time and money, potentially thousands of dollars in examination fees. And the last one that I think is often overlooked is really can result in a more efficient company operation. So a readiness assessment often can identify maybe control issues or weaknesses and things that in the internal operations that if addressed could potentially decrease employee workload, help diminish risk, and maybe strengthen the control environment at the same time. So there's a number of benefits to going through and performing a readiness assessment. Okay. All right, next we want to discuss the steps to a readiness assessment. What is the readiness assessment based on? And the readiness assessment is based on procedures used by the examiner in the NAIC Financial Condition Examiner's Handbook, a handbook that Francois referenced earlier. And the handbook lays out the risk-focused surveillance framework that's used by departments to determine the areas of high risk, which should enable more efficient use of examiner resources. Now, the handbook actually has 7 phases of a regulatory examination, but for purposes of our readiness assessment, we're going to use the first 4, and those are the ones that you see on the slide here. We'll discuss the details of the first 4 phases in the next few slides, but for now, let me give you a high-level overview of the 7 phases of the examination as laid out in the handbook, since the handbook is the foundation for readiness assessment. Phase 1 is understanding the company and identifying key functional activities to be reviewed during the examination, and this is essentially the foundation for planning. Phase 2 is identify and assess inherent risk in activities. And then phase 3 is identifying and evaluating risk mitigation strategies. And this is essentially identifying what controls the company has in place to mitigate the risk that's been identified. And then phase 4 is determining the residual risk. And this is just the risk left over after considering those controls. So those are the ones we're going to talk about, the phases in the next few slides as it relates to the readiness assessment. Now the next 3 phases I'm going to mention are part of the regulatory examination process, but not necessarily part of the readiness assessment. Because if you perform the readiness assessment, you do the steps in it, then these last phases are not a significant issue to deal with at all. And phase 5 is actually, in the examination process, is actually establishing and conducting detailed examination procedures. And this is the old beating the balance sheet approach. So if controls don't adequately address the risk identified in phase 2, then the examiner will have to perform detailed test of balances. Phase 6 is updating prioritization supervisory plans. This is essentially exam wrap-up. So this should not be a time-consuming process unless you have a lot of findings and issues to deal with. And then phase 7 is drafting the examination report and management letter. And this is essentially the reporting phase and the last phase of the exam. But the bulk of the time on an examination is going to be spent on the first 4 phases. And if you performed a readiness assessment, then you should be prepared to deal with this time in the examination without a problem. And for organizations with an internal audit department, the assessment can actually be incorporated into the existing audit procedures. So many companies, even bring in outside independent parties with experience and knowledge of regulatory procedures and hot buttons. So let's move on and get to the next slide and talk about the details of phase 1.
Phase 1, understanding the company. This framework begins with developing a full understanding of the interest company. What are the lines of business? What are the key functional activities, and how they lead to risk solvency? This is by far the biggest phase of the exam. The examiner will spend 35 to 40% of their time in phase 1. It's much more than planning. In fact, phase 1 is made out of 5 parts, and part 1 alone contains 5 steps. So in phase 1, the examiner will gather annual statements, audited financial statements, MD&A, holding company registration statements, risk-based capital reports, and actual opinions for all the years under examination. They will obtain copies of the in-house financial analyst report. They will gain access to the previous examination report and to the previous examination work papers as well. They will meet with the in-house analyst, the in-house actuary. They will meet with the chief examiner to discuss the use of specialists, planning materiality, and discuss their preliminary examination approach. They also have discussion with other regulators when applicable. If you operate in multi-states, you have heard of the term coordinated exam. Ideally, your lead state or the state of domicile will lead the exam and will invite the other states in which you write business to participate in their exam. The idea behind this is that the company should only be subject to one exam, and all the state insurance department would share work papers and coordinate, so you would only have one exam going on at the same time. But in addition to this, well, the examiner will also meet with the company personnel to discuss significant changes in the operation, changes in major lines of business, changes in corporate governance. They will inquire about whether the company has made any changes in their system, if they had any changes in their personnel. They will obtain the trial balance, confirm investments, confirm the bank accounts. Hanging there, I'm almost there. The examiners will also perform a high-level analytical review and review of the operations. And finally, they will also consider IT risks at the company, including the overall IT environment and the IT systems supporting the financial reporting. So if you recall about a minute or two ago, I told you that there were 5 parts in phase 1. Well, all of this was only part 1. As you can see, phase 1 is very involving and time-consuming. I don't necessarily think that we need to go through the entire process during a self-assessment, but I think that the next steps are essential to perform. I think when you're conducting a self-assessment, we should conduct interviews with the executive and review documents to support our understanding of corporate governance and the risk management, the risk environment, and ORSA. And we need to focus on the quality of guidance and oversight provided by the board of directors and the effectiveness of management. The handbook notes that management's philosophy and operating style affect the way the enterprise is managed. I think that's given, including the kind of business risks accepted by management. And that's why it's so important for the examiner. Similarly, your company's internal assessment should focus on the company's tone at the top. What are the leaders' values? How do they convey those values throughout the organization? Also in phase 1, the examiner will review the work performed by your internal audit department, if you have one, and they will also review the work papers prepared by your external auditors, your CPAs. So based on their conclusion, the examiner will then determine whether they can rely or leverage from the work prepared by these internal or external auditors to reduce their own workload, which translates in cost saving to you. So by the end of phase 1, the examiner should have determined and documented key activities, or you can call them key processes or key transaction classes, as well as have develop a preliminary testing approach. This documentation is going to be invaluable during the examination process.
Okay, the second phase of the regulatory examination and our readiness assessment is assessing inherent risk. And in this phase, we identify specific risk of the key activities, focusing on the most common solvency risk for each line of business. And the handbook offers guidance about the primary risk classifications, which we've listed on the screen here. The point of the assessment is to identify risks that are most significant to your organization. That's why the professionals performing the readiness assessment will seek to understand all risk of the organization, including those that are monitored by the company and those that may not even be on the company's radar. In this phase, the assessment and examination will result in a consideration or assessment of the inherent risk rating, which is a function of the likelihood of a particular threat and the potential impact if it were realized. And this should be really familiar language for an internal audit department, as this is the same basic logic used with an IA department when they assess risk. So that's why it's such a good fit to leverage off your internal audit department and just incorporate key elements from the handbook into your current IA plan.
In phase 3, the examiner identify and evaluate risk management strategies and controls in place to mitigate the inherent risks. First, it will focus on identifying and understanding internal controls, including those that are monitored and those that are not monitored. Second, they will consider whether the controls in place appear to be designed properly to mitigate the risks. And third, they will test those controls for operating effectiveness. This is where most of the testing will be performed in an exam. The risk-focused approach requires the examiner to understand the company to identify risks in phase 1, rate those risks in phase 2, then test them in phase 3. The idea behind this process is to increase efficiency by eliminating routine tests that would not have an impact on our conclusion on the solvency of the company, and to review in detail or focus on the high-risk areas.
Okay. Up to this point in the process, we've identified the significant activities in the company. We've identified and assessed inherent risk within those areas, and we've identified and assessed controls that attempt to mitigate those risks. Now in phase 4, we determine the residual risk for each of the inherent risks identified. So residual risk is assessed by determining how well the risk mitigation strategies or controls mitigate the level of risk in the company's activities based on the likelihood of occurrence and magnitude of impact. So determining residual risk is something that requires a lot of professional judgment. So it's possible that a state insurance examination could identify risk as material when you didn't identify them as material in your readiness assessment. But if you've gone through the process and you've performed a readiness assessment, then you have the basis for your assessment, and you'll be able to discuss the assessment intelligently with the examiners. Now, the residual risk will drive how much work the examiner has to do in phase 5. We talked about during the assessment, we're focusing on the first 4 phases, but But in the examination, if residual risk is still high, then the examiner will have to move to phase 5. So this drives how much testing they do. And that's the old beating the balance sheet, or testing the account balances. So a low residual risk means there's not much left for the examiner. So having this assessment done can decrease the amount of time the examiners have to spend in phase 5 and beyond. Also, a high residual risk, especially in hot button areas, are likely to attract the attention of state examiners or regulators. So it's a good idea to know these things before the exam even starts. Now on the next slide, we'll talk about some of those hot buttons. Okay. Hot buttons vary from state to state, but there's a few things that seem to be pretty consistent, really at the top of the minds of many of the regulators, and one is ORSA. ORSA's become a hot topic over the past few years in really every state, and most states have adopted ORSA filing requirements, but there's still some concern in the industry as to how the information is going to be used. How deep should a company drill down when performing its own risk solvency assessment? So if your company happens to be subject to ORSA filing requirements, then you need to understand your department's expectation, your insurance department's expectations, and it might even be necessary to meet with them, make sure you're on the same page. Starting in 2017, the NAIC accreditation process will actually require that all states implement ORSA. So if you're large enough to be subject to the following requirements and you haven't had to do it yet, get ready because it's coming.
Privacy is another area that varies widely from state to state. In our experience, insurance regulators primarily focus on having the right policies and procedures in place to address state privacy regulations. Cybersecurity, that's another that's really important for all industries. The NAIC Cybersecurity Task Force is evaluating current privacy and security regulations and already has released its roadmap for cybersecurity consumer protection. So you can anticipate additional tests in that area. State examiners actually already have started incorporating high-level cybersecurity testing, but that's an area that's going to become more and more important every year. And the main reason you can anticipate even more changes is that the examiner are currently debating whether they should continue using the COVID framework or migrate to the NIST and IST framework. So if you're not familiar with COVID stands for the Control Objective for Information and Related Technology. And you may have heard of COSO, the Commission of Sponsoring Organization of the Treadway Commission. COSO gained popularity about 15 years ago in the early days of Sarbanes-Oxley. The COSO framework details components of an internal control environment a company should put in place to have a sound internal control environment. So COBIT mirrors COSO in many ways, but it targets the IT environment. So we're not saying there's anything wrong with COBIT, but the NIST framework, especially NIST Special Publication 800-53, that's NIST 800-53, has more specific guidelines on security and privacy. Also, NIST has a cybersecurity framework which would help guide the examiner to meet the NIST cybersecurity testing and documentation requirement. So we'll just have to wait and see to determine what the NIST decides on this.
Okay, the bottom line is you don't necessarily know what the examiners will zero in on, but that doesn't mean you should do nothing. So what are some proactive steps you can take to be prepared? Well, you start by incorporating the NAIC Examiner's Handbook into your own internal audit procedures or your own risk assessment. And the handbook includes several exhibits with checklists and questionnaires that can get you started. Those internal assessments should focus on risk examiners are going to be most concerned about. And for more detail about the handbook, especially the critical risk categories, check out the appendix of the handbook, which provides much more granular detail that we're going to get into here about the risk and the nature of those risks. An example of that is companies with affiliates that could affect the insurer's solvency position will consider potentially inequitable contract provisions, guarantees, intercompany tax allocations, that sort of thing. And for those SAP gurus out there, that's SAP 25. But those are things that are often hot buttons with the departments as well. And consider when it makes sense to co-source or maybe fully outsource a readiness assessment. For example, if your company doesn't have the internal resources to conduct one, Even when outsourcing the assessment, your team can streamline the process by reviewing the handbook and be familiar with the critical risk categories. I mean, when considering a teammate with whom you outsource or co-source the readiness assessment, you'll want to consider 3 important criteria: their experience, credentials, and their resources. And Francois is going to talk a lot more about these 3 items on the next slide.
Okay, so that's right, Joe. I think experience, credential, and resources are probably the most critical thing you want to assess from your team, or make sure that your partner has. So regulatory exam experience. Experience is critical when choosing your readiness assessment team. Entrance examinations are different from traditional audits, so make sure that the firm you're considering has performed regulatory exam before, especially in all the states where you operate, because every state insurance department has its own nuances. Professional credentials. Credentials illustrate that your readiness assessment partner is a skilled player. So the Certified Financial Examiner, or CFE designation, is the most important one for an exam, because this is the designation required for an examiner to sign the financial examination report. Then there's the Certified Information Examiner, CIE, or the Automated Examination Specialist, AES designations. These are professionals who dedicate a lot of time into the insurance industry, and both certifications require a lot of testing and preparation to obtain these certifications. And obviously, if cybersecurity is likely to be an area of concern, which it should, the Certified Information System Security Professional, or CISSP, or a Certified Information System Auditor, or CISA, would be the best qualified individual to assist you in this area. And lastly, you want to assess the resources. Make sure that the firm you are considering hiring has the depth of resource you need. Readiness assessment, like state examination itself, they can vary widely in length and intensity. We generally find that they take 50 to 100 hours to complete. So any firm you are considering outsourcing your readiness assessment should have a robust team of experienced insurance professionals who have their fingers on the pulse of the insurance regulatory exam environment. And they should also know the hot buttons that are likely to be red flags with the state insurance departments. Jim?
All right, guys. Well, thank you very much for that. We actually do have a few questions that have come in. We want to get you to address those if you would. Our first question is, when you're doing this work, what are some of the common risks that you're seeing?
Joe, can you take that one?
Yeah, I'll take that. It's really the common risk are what you would expect initially. I mean, on a life company, you're going to look at reserves, P&C, the losses, and certainly the claim cycle. So those are things that then pretty much with every company you're going to have a risk area that's going to be focused on. But other things, investments, maybe the classification of those investments, the investment quality is something we see. The integrity of the data supporting a reserve or loss run is really important. And we've seen recently, we talked about hot topics earlier in ORSA. One of the items, if you are a company large enough to be subject to ORSA, readiness of the company to implement ORSA has been a big risk. So those are things that we're seeing is really, I'd say, common risk areas.
Okay. Well, we've had a follow-up question to that. Actually, it's what are some of the areas that the examiner finds the most weaknesses? Where are they looking the most and seeing their issues?
Okay. You know, one thing that we see a lot is reliance on Excel. I mean, there's nothing wrong with using Excel, but when your entire financial reporting relies on Excel workbooks, you need to be sure that you have controls in place, that either your formulas are protected in your Excel workbook, or that at least your workbook is in a folder that's restricted, where only your people from the finance maybe team has access to that folder, because otherwise, I mean, if there's no restriction on your Excel workbook or the access to your Excel workbook, I mean, you don't get any really efficiency of using Excel. It's just as, if you were doing a whole paper process.
And if you really look, too, if you're just looking at the number of findings that you see, if you were to just pull a lot of examination reports really across any number of states, the most common things, non-compliance with state-specific statutes, we see a lot. Governance items like a board member composition, we've seen issues with that. And we've even seen issues with that, adequate board member, being familiar with the industry. So there's some items we've seen there. And we're still actually seeing issues with custodial agreements and some of the details and making sure that the custodial agreements used match what the NAIC handbook requires.
Something else I was thinking about, disaster recovery plan.
Yeah, we see that a lot.
A lot of companies will have a disaster recovery plan or a business continuity plan, but they're not tested. So another thing is that most of the company, when you ask to see their disaster recovery plan, they'll tell you, we do backups. We back up our files and we recover those files, sporadically on an as-needed basis. Well, business continuity is much more than recovering your file. And here's an example. If you're hit by a hurricane, the fact that you can recover your claims file as of last night, well, it doesn't help you if you don't have a data center, if you don't have anywhere to put all your claim adjusters, and if you don't have a building. So when people think disaster recovery, most of the time they're just thinking about IT, but it's really just, I think, business continuity is so much more.
It's a lot broader.
Yeah, it's broader than disaster recovery, and I think that's what a lot of people don't consider. They just think about recovering their data and don't think about really resuming their operation. How long will it take them to resume their operation if there's a hurricane that wipes out their building? So I think that's probably the main one that we find.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks, guys. We've got one more question that we've received thus far. I encourage our attendees out there to, please, if you've got any questions, type those in, and we'll let Joe and Francois address them. But one more question. It's a two-part question. How much does this typically cost, the service that CRI provides, and how long does it generally take?
Okay. Yeah. One or two things. We can talk about the self-assessment and the exam. And, there's no real answer to this. I mean, I can answer saying it depends, but I can give you probably a better idea of this. If you're talking about a self-assessment, and we said on one of our slides, it's probably 50 to 100 hours. So
you can range from, as far as dollar amounts on the self-assessment, from a few thousand, maybe 4 or 5 to 14 or 15. But one of the things we do is we come in early on and provide that budget based on the company, the complexity of the company, the operations. So if you give us a call and you want us to look at it, you don't go in blind and then get a bill at the end. We come in and say, okay, here's our budget for this, but it's going to be driven by the company size, complexity, and like I said, a few thousand, 4 to 5 to maybe 14, 15 range, really depending on the operations.
And if we compare this to a full examination from a State Department, it's 9 days.
Exactly.
I mean, the examination can take from a few hundred hours to a few thousand hours to complete. I mean, the examiners depend on the state. Some states require us to do an exam in a certain amount of time, so it could take from 2-3 months to up to a year. And your fees can vary widely too. I mean, a small exam can cost you anywhere in the range of $30,000 to $40,000.
That would be very small.
Yeah, that would be very small, and because as you saw in our slides before, we have so many steps to complete, even in phase 1, that it's very difficult to have an exam that's going to cost you less than $30,000 to $40,000. I mean, and for the larger companies, like to name them, but just like a large, like a Blue Cross or something like this, I mean, that's could be $700,000.
It's a wide range of exam costs. So really making an investment in a risk assessment of a few $1,000s on the front end, you can save that much time, that much cost in just the time you have to spend alone. So it can be a really good investment.
Okay. Well, looks like we don't have any more questions. So we thank everybody for attending today. We hope that you now see the benefits of the early preparation for your next state regulatory exam. we highly recommend that you start preparing for your next exam as soon as possible. If you think that you're looking for a teammate, somebody to help you out, then CRI can definitely help you. I hope you can tell by our webinar this morning that our insurance regulatory consulting practice has many experienced insurance professionals. We also have some former state regulatory examiners on our staff as well. We hold a lot of designations, the designations that Francois alluded to on the previous slide. We know the NAIC handbook in and out. We know the nuances of the regulatory environment, and we're very ready to help you score a touchdown and just knock out that next exam. So if you're interested, call us today. Go to the website that you see there on your screen, the URL, and submit some information, and a CRI professional will contact you. Thank you, everyone, for attending this morning. We greatly appreciate your time.